June 2002. Croftton, Maryland. A man pulls a fish out of a backyard pond and makes a phone call he doesn't fully understand yet. Wildlife officials arrive, look at what's in the bucket, and within weeks Maryland DNR drains the entire pond and poisons what's left. One pond, one fish, one call. And then the federal government declared it a national ecological emergency. The fish was a northern snakehead. It could breathe air. It could cross land. It ate almost anything. And the officials who showed up that summer genuinely believed they had caught it in time. That's not what happened. 20 years later, millions of dollars spent, federal task forces assembled, emergency legislation passed, the snakehead is still here, still spreading, still reproducing in American waterways. But here's the part that doesn't fit the story anyone was telling. The population didn't explode the way every model predicted it would. Something slowed it down. Something the government didn't plan for, didn't fund, and didn't put in any of the official reports. And nobody can fully agree on what that something is. I'm Dan, and what you're about to watch is the full arc of one of the strangest ecological stories in recent American history. How a single fish turned into a federal crisis. How 2 decades of intervention produced results nobody can cleanly explain. And what the data we have now actually tells us versus what we were told at the time. But before any of that, you need to understand what makes this animal different. Because the snakehead isn't just another invasive species that hitched a ride in a cargo container. It's something genuinely unusual. The northern snakehead, Channa argus, is native to China, Russia, and Korea. It entered the United States through the live food fish trade, bought at market, kept alive in tanks, and in at least one documented case, released into the wild by someone who simply didn't want it anymore. That single act of carelessness is what started all of this. What makes the snakehead dangerous isn't just its appetite, though the appetite is real. It eats fish, frogs, crayfish, small birds, basically whatever fits in its mouth. What makes it dangerous is everything else. It has a suprabranchial organ that functions like a primitive lung, letting it breathe atmospheric air and survive out of water for up to 4 days. It can wriggle overland between water bodies. It doesn't stay in its lane. And then there's the parenting. Both parents guard the eggs. Both parents protect the juveniles. In a river ecosystem, where most fish larvae are on their own from the moment they hatch, snakehead juveniles get active, aggressive protection. That dramatically changes survival rates. It's not just a predator. It's an organized one. So when officials found that first fish in Croftton, they weren't just looking at a new species. They were looking at a system. And draining one pond was never going to be enough. The snakehead's reputation as an unstoppable colonizer would later become the exact thing that triggered the most aggressive emergency response to an invasive fish in American history. But in 2002, it was just a single pond in Maryland, and officials still believed they could contain it. That belief did not last long. The pond at Croftton sat in a quiet residential neighborhood in Anne Arundel County, roughly halfway between Baltimore and Washington. It was the kind of place where kids fished for bluegill on summer afternoons, and nobody thought much about what lived beneath the surface. Then in June of 2002, a local angler pulled something out of the water that nobody in Maryland had ever seen before. Scaled like armor, with a long dorsal fin running nearly the full length of its body, a mouthful of small sharp teeth, and eyes set wide and flat on a head that looked unmistakably like a snake. He called the Department of Natural Resources. The DNR called federal officials. And within weeks, what had started as a curiosity became a crisis. Maryland officials made the decision quickly. They were going to poison the pond. All of it. Using rotenone, a naturally derived pesticide that disrupts cellular respiration in fish, crews treated the entire water body in the summer of 2002. It was the first confirmed eradication attempt for northern snakehead on United States soil. They pulled out dozens of snakeheads, including juveniles, which told them something deeply uncomfortable. The fish had already reproduced. They weren't dealing with a single release pet. They were dealing with a breeding population. What comes next is the part that still doesn't make sense. Officials declared the Croftton eradication a success. The pond was treated, the fish were dead, the threat was neutralized. Press releases went out. The story seemed to be over. And then, 2 years later, in 2004, a snakehead turned up in the Potomac River. Read that again. The Potomac River, one of the longest and most ecologically complex river systems on the eastern seaboard. A waterway that drains roughly 14,670 square miles of watershed across 4 states and the District of Columbia. This was not a pond. This was not containable. Whatever chance officials had of drawing a line around the snakehead problem, that chance evaporated the moment the first confirmed fish came out of the Potomac. The question of how it got there has never been fully resolved. The most likely explanation is that it wasn't connected to Croftton at all, that somewhere, at some point, someone else had released snakeheads into the river directly. Multiple, separate introductions. Which meant the problem wasn't one rogue fish keeper in Anne Arundel County. It was a pattern. The federal response escalated fast. The US Fish and Wildlife Service began coordinating across state lines, channeling funding and resources into a 6-state response network covering Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York, and Delaware. Each of those states had waterways that connected, in one way or another, to the broader mid-Atlantic drainage system. Each of them was theoretically at risk. The operational scope of what had started as a pond cleanup had expanded into something that looked more like a regional, ecological emergency. In Virginia, the Department of Wildlife Resources assigned Dr. John Odenkirk to lead systematic electrofishing surveys of the Potomac Basin. Electrofishing is exactly what it sounds like. A boat-mounted system sends a carefully calibrated electrical current into the water, temporarily stunning fish near the surface, so they can be counted, measured, identified, and released or removed. It is slow, methodical, exhausting work. You cover the river in sections, moving upstream and downstream through channels and coves, and the shallow vegetated margins where snakeheads prefer to hunt. Odenkirk and his teams began building the first real picture of what the Potomac snakehead population actually looked like, reach by reach, season by season. What they found was significant. The fish were there. They were reproducing. And they were spreading along the river's natural corridors in the way any successful colonizer does, following food and habitat rather than human-drawn boundaries. The bounty programs came next. Several jurisdictions launched financial incentive schemes that paid recreational anglers per fish removed. The logic was straightforward. The Potomac had hundreds of miles of fishable water, more than any government survey team could cover systematically, and recreational fishermen already knew every bend and backwater. Pay them to target snakeheads, and you effectively multiply your removal capacity overnight. It worked, in a sense. A cottage industry emerged. Anglers who had never thought much about invasive species found themselves loading their boats specifically to hunt snakeheads, selling the catch, posting the hauls online, building small local reputations as snakehead specialists. Fishing guides began offering snakehead trips as a premium experience. The fish, it turned out, fought hard when hooked. They were difficult to land. They became, almost accidentally, a sport fish. Everything was in place. The government just didn't know what everything was building toward. Because here is the tension that nobody was talking about openly in those early years. The models being used to project snakehead spread were based on worst-case assumptions. They were built on what the fish could theoretically do, given its biology, given its reproductive capacity, given its ability to survive in degraded water. Those models predicted exponential growth. They predicted a fish that would colonize every connected waterway with terrifying speed, outcompeting native species, restructuring food webs, fundamentally altering the ecology of every system it entered. The response was scaled to match that prediction. But the river itself was not a spreadsheet, and what was actually happening in the water didn't always match what the models said should be happening. Nobody was saying that out loud yet. The surveys were still young, the data was still thin, and the political and institutional momentum behind the eradication effort was enormous. When you have 6 states coordinating, federal funding flowing, bounty programs running, and a fish that the national media has already called a monster, you do not quietly suggest that maybe the problem is more complicated than it looks. The bounty checks would come back to haunt the program. But that's getting ahead of the story. Picture a late October morning on the tidal Potomac, somewhere south of Washington, in the wide, shallow reaches where the river begins to feel less like a river and more like an inland sea. The water is the colour of weak tea, stained with tannins from the autumn leaf drop upstream. Submerged grass beds, primarily hydrilla and wild celery, stretch out in pale green meadows just below the surface. A great blue heron stands motionless at the water's edge, one leg raised, watching. And somewhere in those grass beds, holding almost perfectly still against the current, a northern snakehead waits. By 2006, this scene was playing out across hundreds of miles of the Potomac watershed. Confirmed snakehead populations had been documented from the tidal tributaries near Washington, D.C. all the way down through the Virginia and Maryland tidal reaches toward the Chesapeake. In 4 years, the fish had gone from a single alarming pond in Croftton to a species embedded in one of the most ecologically and politically significant river systems in the country. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The spread was real. The colonization was happening. But the shape of it, the texture of it when you looked at the actual survey data rather than the projections, was different from what the models had warned. It was slower. It was patchier. It did not look like an exponential explosion. It looked like a species finding its footing in a complex system, establishing in some reaches and barely registering in others, constrained by factors that the early risk assessments hadn't fully weighted. In Pennsylvania and New Jersey, isolated populations turned up in certain waterways, almost certainly from separate illegal releases rather than natural dispersal from the Potomac. If you're wondering how that's even legal, so is everyone else. Federal law had banned interstate transport of live snakeheads in 2002, but enforcement at the level of individual fish markets and private hobbyists was, to put it charitably, inconsistent. Live snakeheads were still moving through informal networks, still being sold in some markets as a food fish, still ending up in places they had no business being. Each new isolated population was its own small crisis, its own separate introduction event, its own evidence that the legal framework was struggling to keep pace with the reality on the ground. But here is what the electrofishing surveys were quietly beginning to suggest. The numbers were present. The fish were there. They were not, however, producing the population explosions that the early models had forecast. Odenkirk's teams were covering the same reaches year after year, building a longitudinal dataset that no one else had. And what that dataset showed was a species that was establishing, yes, but not overwhelming. Not restructuring the food web in the catastrophic way the worst-case scenarios had described. The snakehead was becoming, in the language of invasion biology, naturalized. It was finding a place in the existing ecological structure rather than obliterating that structure from the outside. This matters because the entire policy apparatus, the 6-state coordination, the federal funding streams, the bounty programs, the public communication strategy, all of it was built on the assumption that the snakehead was an existential threat to mid-Atlantic fisheries. That assumption was based on the biology, which was real, and on the models, which were reasonable given what was known at the time. But models are only as good as the ecological context they account for, and the Potomac River had a context that was not fully visible in 2002, when officials were standing at the edge of a Maryland pond trying to decide how much rotenone to order. The Potomac is not a pristine system. It is a heavily altered, historically degraded, intensively managed river that has been shaped by 2 centuries of agriculture, urbanisation, sewage discharge, and fisheries intervention. It has native predators. It has established food webs. It has, in some reaches, a remarkably resilient ecological structure that had already survived multiple previous insults. The Snakehead was entering a river that was not empty. It was entering a river that was full. By the mid-2000s, Odenkirk was noting something in his field observations that would take years to fully interpret. The Snakehead was present. It was reproducing. It was not, in most of the reaches he was surveying, achieving the kind of numerical dominance that the early warnings had predicted. Something was keeping the population in check, or several somethings. The surveys couldn't tell you what exactly. They could tell you where the fish were, and roughly how many. They couldn't tell you what was eating the juveniles in the grass beds at night, or what was competing with the adults for the same prey base, or what ecological pressures were shaping the population from directions that the Snakehead-focused surveys weren't designed to detect. Odenkirk would return to the Potomac for surveys in 2025, more than 2 decades after that first confirmed river population. His field notes from those surveys describe a species that has, in his words, integrated into the system rather than dominated it. That phrase carries a lot of weight. Integration is not victory. It is not the catastrophic collapse that was predicted. It is something more complicated and, in some ways, more interesting. A species that came in as a declared enemy and ended up as a permanent resident, absorbed into the ecology of a river that had, quietly, its own ideas about what belonged there and what didn't. The government celebrated the early eradication at Croftton. They shouldn't have, because the real story wasn't in the pond. It was in the river, and in the river something else entirely was already at work. And this is the part where things stop being funny, because up until this point you could still tell the Snakehead story as a kind of dark comedy. A man dumps a fish in a pond. Federal agents show up with rotenone. The fish gets a nickname in the tabloids. Congress passes a law. Everyone goes home feeling like something got done. But by the mid-2000s, the northern Snakehead was established in the Potomac River drainage, and the question was no longer whether it could be stopped. The question was how much it was going to cost to try. The answer, it turned out, was a lot, for a very long time, with very little to show for it in the ledger column marked results. Picture a flat-bottomed electro-fishing boat pushing slowly through a Potomac tributary in the grey light of an October morning. The water is dark and tannin-stained, edged with cattails going brown at the tips. A technician at the bow operates the boom, sending a low electrical current into the water ahead. Fish rise to the surface, briefly stunned, and the crew dips nets to collect whatever comes up. It's methodical, unglamorous work. And by 2006, it was happening across 6 states simultaneously, every season, year after year, funded by a patchwork of federal grants and state agency budgets that would grow, quietly and persistently, into one of the most expensive freshwater invasive species campaigns in American history. Maryland, Virginia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, New York and Delaware formed what you might loosely call a 6-state coalition, each managing their own monitoring programs, their own removal efforts, and their own public communications, while coordinating through federal channels overseen by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Mike Gohl, the U.S. FWS Aquatic Invasive Species Coordinator, managed the federal funding pipelines that kept the campaign operational across those 2 decades. The spending categories were not glamorous. Electrofishing surveys to track population density across known habitat. Habitat treatments in isolated backwaters where Snakehead had established breeding populations. Bounty programs designed to incentivize commercial and recreational fishers to pull fish from the system. Public education campaigns. Federal coordination overhead. And then more surveys to measure whether any of it was working. That's the kind of number that makes accountants cry. Because when you begin to add it up across 6 states, across 20 years, the total runs into the tens of millions of dollars. Some estimates, depending on how you count indirect costs and federal overhead, push higher. And the accounting is genuinely difficult because no single agency maintained a unified ledger. Each state ran its own program. Federal grants flowed through multiple channels. Bounty payouts were tracked locally. What the Associated Press found, in a review of spending published in July 2026, was that no participating state could point to a single, measurable eradication milestone. Not one. Not a river reach where Snakehead had been confirmed absent after a sustained removal effort. Not a tributary where population monitoring showed a meaningful, sustained decline attributable to management intervention. The bounty programs are worth sitting with for a moment because they generated impressive raw numbers. Thousands of fish removed from Maryland waters alone over the course of the program. Anglers were motivated. The fish are aggressive, they hit lures readily, and there was money attached to each one brought in. By the early 2010s, Snakehead had even developed a modest following among sport fishers who found them genuinely challenging to catch and, as it turned out, genuinely good to eat. The Maryland Department of Natural Resources leaned into this, promoting Snakehead as a table fish, trying to build a commercial harvest incentive that might sustain removal pressure without ongoing government subsidy. But the version you've heard, that's not the full picture. Because despite thousands of fish removed through bounty programs and targeted electrofishing, survey populations did not collapse the way the removal rates implied they should. Population models built on catch per unit effort data showed something stubborn happening in the background. Remove fish from a stretch of river, and within a season or two, density readings in that stretch would recover toward baseline. The fish were reproducing faster than the programs could remove them, or they were moving in from adjacent habitat, or both. Probably both. The Potomac is a large, complex river system with hundreds of kilometres of connected tributaries, backwaters, and floodplain wetlands. It does not behave like a pond in Croftton, Maryland. You cannot drain it. You cannot treat it with rotenone. You can only work at the margins and measure what changes, if anything does. What the data showed consistently through the late 2000s and into the 2010s was that snakehead populations were not crashing, but they were also, in many reaches, not exploding. By roughly 2015, biologists monitoring the Potomac drainage were beginning to note something that didn't fit the original catastrophe model. Population levels in established areas seemed to be stabilizing, not declining sharply, not surging dramatically, but plateauing. The ecological apocalypse that had been forecast in 2002, the collapse of native fish communities, the wholesale restructuring of river food webs, had not materialized in the way the models predicted. This created an uncomfortable question for the agencies that had spent 2 decades and tens of millions of dollars on control. Had the spending worked? Had it held the population in check, preventing a worse outcome? Or had something else been doing the heavy lifting all along, something that didn't appear in any budget line? The scientists who began asking that question found themselves looking not at what humans had done to the river, but at what the river had already been doing to the snakehead, quietly, since the moment the first fish slipped out of the Potomac drainage and into the main channel. Everything the snakehead had built was about to work against them. There's a moment in early spring, before the river warms enough to turn green, when the shallows of a Potomac tributary look almost prehistoric. The water is clear and cold. Fallen timber lies in the margins, bark long gone, wood bleached to silver. And if you watch long enough, you see movement. A bowfin holding in the current behind a submerged log, barely moving, its long dorsal fin rippling like a flag in slow wind. An ancient fish, a fish that was already old as a species when the first snakehead ancestor was evolving somewhere in Central Asia. And it is, as it turns out, very good at eating snakehead. This is the part of the story that the early models missed, not because the data was hidden, but because the question wasn't being asked yet. The Chesapeake Bay watershed already had predators. It had always had predators. And when a new, aggressive, air-breathing fish moved into the system and began reproducing in the shallows, those predators noticed. Stomach content studies confirmed what biologists eventually started looking for. Largemouth bass and striped bass, both opportunistic and abundant in the Potomac drainage, were taking juvenile snakehead. Bowfin, that ancient survivor, was competing directly with adult snakehead for territory and preying on their young. Catfish, bottom-feeding generalists that share the same slow-water habitat, were consuming snakehead eggs and small juveniles from the substrate. And overhead, the aerial predators, osprey, great blue herons, bald eagles, all three of which had recovered dramatically in the Chesapeake watershed over the preceding decades, were observed taking snakehead at the surface. A 2024 analysis by the NOAA Chesapeake Bay program identified native predator pressure as a primary factor in the snakehead population plateaus that monitoring data had been showing since the mid-2010s. Not the only factor, but a primary one. Think about what that means. The river was not passive. It was not simply a habitat waiting to be overwhelmed. It had structure and history and a set of animals that had been shaping each other for thousands of years. The snakehead arrived into that structure, and the structure pushed back. Back at the beginning of this story, there was a pond in Croftton, isolated, still. No bass, no bowfin, no heron working the shallows at dusk, just a fish and open water, and nothing between it and the future. That was the condition that made the snakehead terrifying. Remove that condition. Put the fish into a living river with its full complement of hunters and competitors, and the story changes. We didn't save the Potomac. We watched it. A snakehead still swims in the Potomac right now. Subscribe to catch more comeback stories that the official reports never quite explain.